You're with Julian on the Browno and the third of four parts on the Israel Palestine conflict. And one of the big questions that's touted around, or statements, is about how Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. Now, there is an important racial component to making that statement, and it's this: we're not like those Arabs, we're not like those Muslims. That's why it's so prominently used. But actually, they are, because they are a borderline theocracy, and a state that's run on religious principle as a guiding law, a foundational aspect, cannot be a democracy. They basically are a lot closer to Saudi Arabia than they are to a European democracy. Israel has several institutions similar to other democracies: elections, parliament, government and the Supreme Court, but they do not function as independent or equal branches of government and lack transparency. There are 5 core reasons why Israel isn't a democracy. First, Israel doesn't have a constitution and is unable to draft one, since the concept of a Jewish state contradicts democratic principles of pluralism, secularism and equal rights. You can't have a country that says one race or ethnicity or religion gets a separate, superior group of rights and laws in their favour and call yourself democratic. Second, Israel doesn't separate religion and government. It routinely passes religious bills on the issues of family, marriage, divorce and immigration to prevent non-Jews from immigrating or to remain in the country in order to give Jews priority. Here it's far closer to Saudi Arabia. And the fact that a Palestinian who has been evicted from his home and has fled overseas as a refugee is denied a right of return, whereas a Jewish person anywhere on earth with no connection to Israel has an automatic legal right to go to live forever in Israel and citizenship, doesn't sound very democratic to me. Third, Israel doesn't give most of the Palestinians the right to vote. It controls the West Bank and Gaza, but doesn't recognise the Palestinians' population there as citizens. The argument they're not part of Israel doesn't wash any longer in light of over 50 years of occupation and a massive settlement project. And one of the big reasons why these settlements, the West Bank and Gaza Strip, are so intrinsically important that we don't talk about. They can't admit that many Palestinians into the Israeli state because they might just be outnumbered at the polling booth. So they can't allow millions more Palestinians to be part of the Israel state because they might actually lose the elections. So that's a big thing. And the other is that it's a source of enormous free labour. So they have to gradually breed them out because they actually are fighting against the actual core tenet of democracy, which is that the weight of civilian votes will decide who governs the country, and there will be in a great deal of danger of being in the minority. Fourth, Israel doesn't separate between the executive and legislative branch. All of its government ministers, including prime ministers, are also members of the legislative branch. This dual capacity violates separations of power, a prerequisite for a functioning democracy. Fifth, Israel doesn't have an independent Supreme Court. The controlling party, and thus the Prime Minister, has significant influence in appointing Supreme Court judges. Seems certain elements of Israeli functional governance has bled into America a little bit. A truly independent court is created by a constitution, not by legislature. Without one, the Supreme Court doesn't have the guidance to determine the constitutionality of laws, since the highest court was created by legislators in the Knesset, which has the power to expand and constrict its judicial scope. It's not free to pass judgment on their laws. The litmus test of any democracy is the level of tolerance it's willing to extend towards minorities living in it. In this respect, Israel falls far short of being a democracy. If Australia had a set of rules for Christians and a different one for anyone that wasn't, how much of a democracy would you call that? If it had different laws on home ownership, land ownership, movement, on the ability of you to come to Australia based on your religion or your ethnicity, I'm not sure how democratic you would call Australia. And if it was occupying New Zealand at the same time and subjugating their people both in New Zealand and the million or so New Zealanders living in Australia to extremely harsh treatment based on their ethnicity or country or origin, I'm not sure you'd call it a democracy. The occupation itself isn't democratic, and neither is imprisonment without judicial process, which is a daily occurrence in Israel and by Israel, who continually imprison every fifth Palestinian in the West Bank or Gaza Strip has gone under imprisonment without trial, where they're held indeterminately at the whim of the state of Israel. So there are a raft of reasons why Israel, despite paying the obvious lip service of a democratic election, isn't a functioning democracy. It's a theocracy, and much more in the vein of Saudi Arabia than it is in the United Kingdom or Australia.